Hi, I'm Allie. Join me as I show you how to make this cookie cutter bracelet. Remember, if you need any of the 4mm or any of the seed beads, go ahead and look below the video where we have a link to our site that lists all the materials that you need and also other color ideas as well. So gather up your materials on your bead on a board and let's get ready to get started. To start with our cookie cutter bracelet, we're going to be using the gray DragonThread, and I'm using size 6. You can use size 6 or size 8 with this, and I have a size 10 needle. I have a nice figure 8 clasp enclosure that we'll be adding, but right now I have a stop bead on approximately 5 feet of my thread. We're going to come back and add the clasp after the fact. Some bracelets, when you're doing it, these kind of look like crisscross cookies. You are going to go back and come back and you'll add those clasps so you don't need a lot of room. With this one, we're progressing forward. We're not doing them as each independent units like the focal earrings, if you kind of notice this pattern. We're going to do it as a bracelet. So to start out, I'm going to show you how we go from the inside out on the first one, and then we go from the outside in for all the progressive ones. To start, I'm going to be using one color of my 8/0 seed beads, and I am using my 4mm fire polished rounds, and I have that Aztec color. I'm going to put on a connection or a collection of 4 for my cookie cutter here. So I have 3 and 4. Whatever you start out with, 8/0, you want to make sure that you end with the opposite bead. So I'm ending with my 4mm. So I have 4 8/0s as well as 4 of my Czech fire polished rounds. I'm going to sew back through the first 3 beads. So I'm sewing back through 4mm and the 2 8s on either side of that, and bringing this into a basically almost right angle or a squared unit. From here, we are going to progress by adding some beads along the sides, and then we're going to kind of link them all up together. So to add our beads along the side, coming out that 8/0, we're going to add 2 8s. I'm going to stick with the same color, followed by 1 4, followed by 2 8s. From here, we're going to sew back through that 4mm that our thread is currently coming out of, and we're going to progress through the next 4mm bead and out to the next 8/0 seed bead. And that's just going to make this little additional bump up that hangs out there. From here, same thing, 1 2, and we're going to do this 4 times, since 4 times is part of our rotation. Back through that bead from the opposite side, then through the next 4mm and out the next 8/0. And see how that's just kind of setting it up in this little cross section here. 2 beads, round, 2 beads, and back through. Cross section again. And as we add the last one on here, then we'll get ready to kind of join them all together. So we're going to do our 2 beads here, 4mm, 2 beads. Sew back through. This time when I sew back through, I'm going to sew through the next 4mm fire polished round bead, sew through that first 8/0 seed bead that our thread was coming out of. Once you have that pulled nice and tightly, I want you to step up. Now, the step up is going to be through those first 2 8/0 seed beads and through the 4mm bead, as well as that first 8/0 right after that bead. And here we're set up to make our connection. Our next step is going to be adding in 4 of our 4mm beads between each of these little kind of peaks that we've created. I'm coming out the 8/0 after the 4mm. I'm going to add a 4mm bead, and then I'm going to sew through the next 8, 4, 8 in rotation. So remember, we did those peaks there with 2 8s, then 1 4, then 2 8s. We're grabbing the 8 on either side of the 4mm. Once we're out here, we're grabbing another one of our 4s, sewing through, grabbing the 8, 4, 8, on through to the next one. So because we're doing this here, we're going to do it 4 times and grab on. Now, depending on the size of your 4mm, if your 4mm is more a true 4mm round rather than a Czech 4mm, which is a little bit more of an olive shape. You may need an 11-0 seed bead next to that so you don't have a ton of three-dimensionalness going on. From here, I'm going to sew through my next 4mm, my next 8, my next 4, and I'm just basically locking the shape in place by sewing through those beads, giving a nice tight pull, and then I'm going to get ready to exit through one of the 4mm that sits by itself, not one of the ones that's stacked one on top of the other, one that sits by itself. See how that stop bead wants to hang out towards the top? Just kind of pull it to the bottom. And there we finished one of those cookie cutter components. Rather than tying this off and going on, we're going to keep going in and keep creating more of these components. To do so, we're going to create our first little link, and I'm going to switch colors for each of one of my components for 3 of our colors. Once you finish your first component, or in my case, I jumped ahead to the 5th component so you could see it kind of in action here, we are going to add on kind of from the exterior and then go to the interior. So the first thing when coming out of the 4mm is to add 5 of your seed beads, and I'm switching to my next kind of brighter opaque red color, and I'm going to sew just like we're doing through the 8/0s back through that 4 that my thread is currently coming out of, and that is going to be on the opposite side of where I started basically. It's going to create a little 5-point peak, and I want to sew down through that first 3 beads. So I'm coming out of bead number 3, and what I'm going to do here coming out of bead number 3 is I'm going to get ready to do my interior set of 4. To do the interior set of 4, you're going to do 4 of your Czech fire polished rounds, but only 3 of your 4mm, or your 8/0 seed beads rather, because we're already going to have one that we're coming out of. So I have my 4 4s on, and I have them separated by 1 8/0 each. I'm going to come back to that same bead that my thread is coming out of, and I'm going to go into that bead from the opposite side and pull that into that nice center section. From here, sew through the next 4mm and come out through the next 8/0 seed bead. So now you should recognize and look, oh, I already have that first point done, which is the connector point from the other one. And from here, we're going to continue the pattern. So 2 8s, 1 4, 2 8s. We're coming out the 8. We're going to sew back into the 8 from the opposite side to create our little top of our crisscross here. Sew through the next 4, sew through the next 8 from that interior row. Continue on just like we've been doing. So all you're doing basically is when you connect them, you are starting with one of those peaks already completed because we're adding it on. Coming out this last one then, so you'll have 3 additional peaks. Originally we started out with 4. We're sharing that 4th one, going through. And then as I complete this, and I have all these peaks in here, and I have all of those sets of 4, that crisscross cookie ready to go, and you can see that's a pretty pattern as is. I want you to go up through beads number 4 and 5 from that original group of 5. Sew through that 4mm bead, that's the connector between the 2. And then also through the first 8. Then simple as can be, we're connecting again. 4mm bead through the next 8, 4, 8, and then over to the next peak. Once again, add a 4mm, go through the 8, the 4, the 8 after the 4, and add your next bead. Total of 4 get added here. Going the whole way around, doing that same process. And then as you add the last one in place, you're going to sew up through that bead before the 4, that's the connector. And now all I have to do is get to the opposite side. So I'm going to sew around the outer edge, which actually tightens up the piece a little bit. Pull the thread, going the whole way over, and making sure as I exit, and you're going to have about 8 connectors or 8 of your pieces here. It'll have a tiny bit of an arch to it that'll arch down, and as you wear it, it'll kind of flatten out. If you really want it to arch, pull it really tight. And now I'm ready to go with my transparent color. So I kind of have that matte, the opaque, and the transparent lining in for a nice patterned bracelet. So I'm going to go back in now, start again. I have my 4 beads ready to, or my 5 beads ready to go. Back through that 4. So down through beads 1, 2, and 3. Exiting after bead number 3. And ready to go to create that center interior line of those 4mm beads that sit here. So there I have that line ready to go, and I'm ready to add my next component onto the piece. Once you're finished with your design, it's time to put on the clasp. So all I've done is put on 8 of my 8 seed beads next in color line and sewed through my figure 8 clasp end. It's a big clasp, so I have 8 of my components. You might need 8 or 9. 8 should get you. And we're going to make a loop on the other side. So the figure 8 is really just a clasp all into itself. And I'm going to make sure as I'm sewing through and adding those 8 beads that I go back through that 4mm that was my thread was coming out of. So instead of 5 beads, added 8 in my clasp, and I'm reinforcing this by putting 3 lines of thread through those beads, connecting that clasp. From here, I'm going to sew down through the project a little bit after that 3rd time through, and on the other side, I'm going to make a loop for that figure 8 to go through. So to get rid of the thread, how are you going to get rid of the thread when you need to tie it off? Basically, I go back into the design. So I'm going to find an area here where the thread naturally flows. Then I'm going to go towards the interior. I don't want any extra thread showing. I want that nice crisscross pattern there, and it looks really nice with the opaque red here. Once I have a place where I know that the thread I can tuck underneath it, or a bridge thread, the thread that connects one bead to the other, I'm going to make a loop and sew through it once, sew through it twice. And what that's going to do is give me a nice sewer's knot. You want to pull tightly, pressing down, and get that knot right next to those beads. From here, sew back up into the design, a little bit further, follow that thread path of where it's going. I can tie off one more spot, grab my thread burner, and burn off that extra thread. What I'm going to do on the other side is take my needle off here, cut my thread down, put the needle on this end, and then get ready to, after taking my stop bead out and getting my thread and needle, to come out the opposite end of my 4, just make a loop. This time, instead of 8, I want the loop to be a little bit bigger. I'm going to go with 10 beads. On the opposite side here, once you're done, again, you can go in and just do that loop of 10. I've gone around and restitched, and I'm just getting ready with scissors, thread burner, threads up, cut that down, burn it flush against the project. And then on this side here, you just have that nice loop for your clasp to go into. It's a fun clasp that kind of sets the tone of the design and makes it just that little additional look to the end of it. I love how you can really add on to this bracelet if you want to. Make a necklace, get some extra supplies, and the colors, really playing with the colors, really play with how they look on the wrist. As always, thank you so much for joining me in creating this cookie cutter bracelet tutorial. If you need any supplies, remember they are listed underneath the video, as well as links to that focal earring, which this is kind of based off of a little bit. Remember also, if you want to subscribe to the monthly Best Box or Best Box XL to get your chance on projects like this, hit that button as well too, because we'll put a link in there. As always, don't forget to comment and let us know that we're on the right track. Help out other Potomac beaders that may be watching, giving suggestions or advice as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for our next inspirational design.